Yeah, thank you. As I usually say, I like taking everyone to church, so there's a little bit of call and response. So, hi, everyone. Hi. Thank you. Let's get some conversation going. I'm Ollie Folayan. I'm a chemical engineer. I'm also co-founder of the Association for Black and Minority Ethnic Engineers, and I'm also a member of the Royal Academy of Engineering Diversity and Inclusion Steering Committee. And last year, we had a really good experience, a good fortune of being able to do a number of podcasts. And the podcasts tried to chart the path, D&I path, of the average person from the very start of their career to the end. And so we had 3 topics: pipeline, culture, and boardroom. And so whilst it's very important for us to have a diverse workforce, and there's been some discussion around the Parker Review and numbers today, it's even more important to have an inclusive workforce. And so what we're trying to do today, the question we're asking is, what makes for an inclusive culture? For anyone who started their career like me, you'd be very familiar with the feeling of being the outsider, of coming into a situation, and this is even not always to do with some of the obvious categorizations like race or gender, might just be something to do with you being you in the workplace. We would all be familiar with that. And so what we want to try to anchor our discussion today in is the lived experiences of people. We also want to try to come away, hopefully, with a better understanding of what makes for an inclusive culture, but also a few tips of what we can do. And so to do that, I've got the best panel, people I want to be like when I grow up. We have Polly Williams, who's the head of diversity here at the Royal Academy of Engineering. We have Pavneet, who's head of diversity at Unleashed. Greg is the head of D&I at Rolls-Royce. And we also have, so that we are completely inclusive, we also have someone who is young and just coming into the industry, who is one of the success stories of the Royal Academy GEEP program, Yetunde. You're all welcome.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start with you, Greg. We had a conversation just a few days ago, and you shared some of your experiences with me. When I asked the question, what does inclusion mean to you, would you like to share a little bit of that with us?
Absolutely, thank you. So I'm going to share a bit about my personal story and my career and things that have happened that have helped shape who I am today. I'm going to start by going all the way back to the mid-90s. At that point, I'm finishing my GCSEs, I'm about to go into my A-levels. After that, I start university, studying for a degree in mechanical engineering. And then also into the early 2000s when I started my career. During that entire phase of my life, something just wasn't right. So I wasn't particularly happy. I was always on the fringes of whatever was going on, not really in the center of anything. And performance-wise, maybe wasn't living up to expectations, quite performing as I wanted to. And to other people, that was just me. That was just normal. I was at my level, and I was always that person who was tended to be on the side. If a word summed me up, it was probably average. And that's a really awful word to use when you're describing yourself or anybody else. To me, though, there was no mystery about it. It was absolutely clear what was causing me to be like that. And I've known since I was 12, maybe 13, that I happen to be a gay man. But being brought up in the Northeast in a mining community at that time, being in the closet really felt essential. I thought this just has to be what I do, and that became my norm. And that absolutely affected the way I behaved and interacted in my studies and in my early career. Fast forward to 2006, and at that point, I joined Rolls-Royce. Also at that point, I would describe my mental health as being fragile. And I knew why it was fragile. It was the way I was behaving and the things I felt I had to do to get by. So I started to reconsider the way I was behaving, and I decided from that point onwards, no more lies. I'd be honest if somebody asked me a question, and funnily enough, coming out became a mechanism through which I started to introduce myself to people, the real me. And how did I do that? Well, one of the techniques at the time, a little known platform that was just coming through called Facebook, and whatever happened to that. The fear, genuine fear I would have when I would see a friend request pop up from a colleague, because on Facebook I was my authentic self, and I had a partner, and I was open about who I was. I'd started to come out to my friends and my family, but that fear of a colleague has added me on Facebook, and I thought, I'm going to accept. So gradually I started to come out to people at work in that sense. Actually, that was probably the worst thing I could have done, because what I found was I now didn't know who knew what. So when I was having those conversations at work, I'm trying to work out, does this person know my big secret? Does this person know that I have a boyfriend? And then you start using gender neutral language again, talking about your partner, your other half. So you're not really being that authentic. So it was a real position of trying to do the right thing. It was helping a bit. I wasn't getting any negative responses, but I wasn't really fully out. So I still wasn't getting past those challenges that I'd always faced. Fast forward again to 2015. At this point, Rolls-Royce decided it was going to launch an LGBTQ plus employee network, something I'd not really thought about before, hadn't really been particularly interested in getting involved in. But somehow, and to this day, I still don't fully understand how this happened, but somehow I was asked to lead that network, and I accepted the offer, and I did that for 6 years. That meant I became instantly visible. The very first event we did, 200 people in a room like this, I stood on the stage and I said, I'm Greg, and I'm a gay engineer. Literally at that second, as those words came out of my mouth, I could feel the pressure come off my shoulders. Instantly, it happened. But I was visible. I could no longer be hidden. I couldn't hide in the shadows and not be the honest me because of the visibility that role brought with it. It also gave me a community, people around me who knew what I'd been through, who had similar challenges. And in turn, we then could create a support network, making sure that everybody else who had those same issues could support one another. And perhaps most importantly, it gave that community a voice. So we became the voice of LGBTQ plus colleagues into the business. We could help shape strategy, direction, activities to make Rolls-Royce more inclusive for LGBTQ plus people. So what's the impact of that? For me personally, instantly happier and healthier, most importantly. On the back of the launch of our network, Prism, pretty quickly, back-to-back promotions. My performance improved dramatically at work. I was shortlisted for an award at the British LGBT Awards, which I was very proud about. But even more importantly, we've taken Rolls-Royce from a company that didn't talk about LGBT issues to a Stonewall Top 100 employer. And that's the biggest achievement that I think we've done as a company in this space. So I was excelling in my job. I moved into an HR role where I now focus full-time on diversity and inclusion. Incidentally, I tell people now, I find it easier to come out as gay than I do to come out as working in HR. But that's a whole other story. And also, don't make that joke in front of HR people, I've learned. But it's really, really important that we follow our passions. And actually, that's what this has done. It's allowed me to be myself and to excel at work and actually to start achieving. If our network hadn't have come along, I'd still be an average engineer. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that wasn't what I wanted for myself. So to answer the question, what makes an inclusive culture, for me, one of many, many things that has to happen, but for me, it's about having those mechanisms and those resources in place, so things like employee networks, so that you can support your people, give them a community, and give them a voice back into the business.
Thank you for that. That's really powerful. And just building on that, actually, very often we think about the term coming out mainly in relation to LGBT issues, but that can apply to disabilities as well and those kinds of situations. And Polly, we were chatting earlier, and you have, if you like, your story and what's brought you into this. So I'm going to put the same question to you. What does inclusion mean to you?
Yes, so I've worked in diversity and inclusion for almost since university, so very aware and alive to different issues. But it wasn't until 2012 when I started getting some odd symptoms, And I went through a number of series of tests, and 2015 was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And I didn't really tell anyone at work. I went through a number of different organisations, partly because I wasn't really confident or comfortable myself in understanding what it meant for me and any lifestyle changes and kind of what the future would look like. But then also it just, in the workplace, I was able to kind of manage it on the whole, but a few things I had to hide. So when I started taking medication, I kind of hid how sick I felt for weeks on end by just kind of leaving meetings in random moments, which my colleagues probably thought was a bit strange. There was a fairly kind of opening and welcoming culture, but in terms of disabilities, being diagnosed with something later in life and going through the whole kind of that process of it, and understanding what it means for you, talking to your family, telling your friends, all of those kind of stages that you go through. It was felt quite a big step to kind of come out in the workplace and tell people, because once you do, everybody knows, and then being prepared for questions and how you might respond to those. So it did take a while to kind of go through those stages, but I started off speaking to my manager, who was incredibly supportive, and she was able to allow kind of the space for me to share as much information as I needed, take the time that I needed for appointments, and be there for that kind of support. So the kind of, and then when I moved to the Royal Academy, I came with a kind of, this is who I am, and I'm bringing this with me, and it's not something I'm going to hide necessarily. Not that I was hiding it before, but it is a big, it's something that you have to disclose almost every time sometimes, and some of the feelings around that, and something to adjust to. So inclusive culture for me is, when we think of diversity, we've got visible diversity characteristics, but there's so much underneath in terms of what people are experiencing, different diversity elements, that inclusive culture allows somebody to be able to share those if they want to, and the support mechanisms in place, and managers that are empowered, aware, have the knowledge to be able to handle and support their team with those, and then hopefully a culture that you've got where you can bring your whole self as much as you want to, and I've felt a kind of more, as similar to Greg, kind of happier, more confident, being able to not have this thing that I'm keeping kind of quiet in the background. So yeah, that's for me some echoes of Greg's story in a different way.
Thanks for that, Polly. I mean, you both talked about an element that was quite critical for your sort of feeling of inclusiveness was having managers that were supportive, having an environment that was supportive. And Pavneet, you do a lot of work helping others try to create that environment. I'm sure that there are leaders here who are thinking, I wonder how many of our staff feel it the same way, who code switch and feel like they can't really be their authentic selves. Would you like to tell us what inclusion means for you, and perhaps some of those guidelines that can help these companies would be great.
Thank you, Ollie. I'm Pavneet Khurana, and as Ollie said, I'm Head of Inclusion for Unleashed, and we are people and culture specialists, so not HR, we'll have a chat about that later, Greg. So naturally I'll take that stance when answering this particular question, what does inclusion mean? More broadly, it means different things to different people, as we've heard from Greg and Polly, that the experiences that they have shared with us, they have needed and needed support in different ways in order for them to feel valued and accepted and heard. So inclusion does mean different things for different people. It means different things for different organisations. And if we think about the broad definition of inclusion, it is the act of creating an environment that values, supports and accepts every person. So naturally we do have to take an individualised view to what that meaning is for our organisation. But that can often feel quite ambiguous and quite intangible when we position it in that way. And commonly what we hear from founders and leaders and managers is that's quite big and scary, and I don't know what to do with that big ambiguity. So they sit in this place of avoidance of, I don't have enough resource, I don't have enough budget, I don't have enough time to really think about this, or in fear, I don't know what to do, I don't want to make the wrong choice. I don't want to misstep. And so that's a completely human response to sit in this place of avoidance and fear when we're met with ambiguity, when we're met with uncertainty. So part of the work in answering this question on how to create an inclusive culture is to help people to take that step away from avoidance and away from fear and to bring them into a space of action, but just by taking the first step. Naturally, we've all been in those places before where we've avoided something or we've been afraid of something, but when we do take a tiny little step, we're able to see something transformational. So the way in which we work with organisations to really try and understand what that first step is to answer the question of what does this inclusive culture really mean to me or to us. We've developed this framework for inclusion and diversity, which I'll briefly talk you through, that could be a helpful starting point to explore that question in a bit of detail. And essentially, it's 5 levers of change that we, within the research that we've done, have had the most impact on sustainable change when it comes to creating an inclusive culture. So the first is data, and we spoke a lot about data in the previous panel, but data for exploration, not for measurement. Understanding how we can widen our vision through data, asking questions to our teams, to the individuals within our organisation, asking them about their lived experiences, like we've heard already, but to contextualise some of the ambiguity that we might be experiencing. So asking questions like, do I feel like asking people to explore whether or not they've been treated fairly in certain situations, how psychologically safe they feel. And we can do that quantitatively through surveys, or we can do that qualitatively through conversations or workshops or just team discussions. And again, we spoke about in the previous panel a bit about capturing demographic data, but specifically capturing demographic data to shine light on the differences between those individual experiences, to show the nuance in what people need and think and feel. So, for example, are we seeing within our organisation that Black women are feeling less engaged and less psychologically safe than white women or Asian women? If we see that, we're able to explore, try and look further into that and explore why and get underneath the skin of that. So data to widen our vision. The second is leadership. Accountability for inclusion sits across everybody within the organisation, but it starts at a leadership level. So asking questions of our leaders to ensure that they are committed to this work. Are they role modelling inclusive behaviours? Are we gathering feedback from other people within the organisation about what they think, how effective they think the leaders are with this work, to uncover some of the blind spots. And actually, our leaders as individuals widening their vision as well. How are they educating themselves with it, with this work? The third, how far am I? 3. Number 3 is strategy, and not just crafting a strategy for inclusion and diversity, but looking at our current strategy, looking at our current organisational goals, and seeing how we can look at those goals through the lens of inclusion and diversity. So our product strategy, our marketing strategy, our growth strategy, how, if we were to look at those through the lens of inclusion, we will see something completely different. Are we listening to the experiences of our users, our consumers, our customers, our partners, to build that perspective? The fourth is, what is the fourth? The fourth is culture. And again, probably a prominent part of this is to explore how we're defining our culture. Do we understand what we want as a unique organisation, what the principles of an inclusive culture look and feel like? And we can often do that by asking those questions. But do we know what our values are? Are we crafting an experience through our culture that honours those principles? And the last is people experience that Greg briefly touched on as well. Looking at the different facets of the employee experience to understand how we can unpick some of those components like onboarding, like performance evaluation, and look at those through the lens of inclusion and equity and fairness as well. Even asking questions around why are people leaving, how are people experiencing the performance conversations, are there fair opportunities for learning and growth across all people across the organisation? And that's without looking at that through a demographic lens, but through individuals and through hearing individual voices. So there's a lot to unpack within those 5 naturally, and they will all look differently with every organisation, but a useful starting point to take that step away from fear and ambiguity.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I think, I was very keen after we spoke to actually include those elements, just so that everyone we've got some tangible sort of pillars we can weave all of our other discussions around inclusion around. And one part of the conversation that is often missing is the next generation or younger generation. And Yetunde, you recently joined the industry. You've had some really positive experiences, but there are other areas that you would like to see improve. Would you like to share some of those with us?
Hi everyone. I've recently graduated from university last year with my master's in civil engineering. And also as part of that, in my second year, I actually attended the GEEP course here. So I did that in 2018, I think. And then actually off the back of that, I think that was one of the reasons why I was successful in getting a placement. So I did a placement during my studies where I worked for a construction company for about a year, about 14 months. Then I went back to university. So I'm currently working as a civil engineer for contractors called CISC. And as part of that, I'm also just got on board with their EDI team. So I'm part of that as well. And actually for the Royal Academy as well, I was part of their advisory panel for a diversity and inclusion grant that they recently just launched. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of it. So I've not been in the industry as long as everyone on this panel, but from my experiences in the past, well, from my year in industry and in the past like 6 to 8 months or so, I've had both negative and positive experiences. I'm going to talk about the positive experiences. So currently in my team, we're a small team, but they're a very inclusive team. And I feel like something that makes them inclusive is that everyone is on board with creating that inclusive environment. And also as well, like they acknowledge that we all are different and we've all had our different experiences coming up to where we are. So you have people of all ages, from all backgrounds, all diverse backgrounds, and being able to create an environment where people are comfortable to speak about their experiences. And then also we can, in that environment as well, analyze people's strengths and weaknesses and take those and use them within our job. So I think that creating that inclusive culture coming from everyone is something that for me has really created that positive inclusive culture at my current workplace. I've also had negative experiences. So I previously worked in a job where I didn't feel like I was included in the team, and I did feel that impacts my performance as an engineer. I was less motivated to come to work. I wasn't performing at the standard that I knew I could perform at. And part of that, I think, was because I didn't feel like the whole team was on board with creating an inclusive environment. And I saw people who had started at the same time as me or after me, really included in their team, and their team got behind them. But I felt like my team really kind of left me behind and made me feel excluded. And I felt that, like I said, that was because they weren't necessarily on board with that inclusive culture. And I feel like seeing the differences between the culture environment where people aren't on board with creating that inclusive environment, and seeing a team that people are on board in creating that inclusive environment really makes a difference to an individual working in those environments. Whether you see it or not, obviously people have their own stories, so they'll handle those situations differently. But 100%, I think that everyone needs to be on board in creating that inclusive environment. For someone like me, coming up quite young and making my way through the industry, it's really important.
And you had a fantastic start. Thank you very much for that. I wanted to ask a question on the app, but before I do that, I think I'd like to involve you all in this fascinating conversation. So, do we have anyone who would like to ask a question? Someone from any questions from the floor before I use the questions from the app? Someone at the back.
Hi, thanks so much for, so I'm losing my voice. Thanks so much for sharing your stories and experiences. As you're probably aware, we work in hierarchies, and these can often cause problems with inclusive cultures. I wondered if the panel had any thoughts on how do you embed inclusivity in organisations that are so stringent on their hierarchies, which can often cause a lot of marginalisation and silencing of different communities?
That's a really interesting question. I'm gonna put it to you, Greg. Sorry, just because you gave us such a fascinating story at the start, so it's your reward. Would you like to try, just using the context of Rolls-Royce, perhaps have a stab at answering it?
It's always great to start with an easy question. Thank you. For me, it's about involving the leadership. So we have diversity in our senior levels as well. So for our LGBT network, we were immediately reaching out to the most senior LGBT people in the business, not very many of them, admittedly, but asking them to support and get involved. And then it's the same across all the different diversity strands. So using those people to share the message, to act as role models, and to really help us promote our values and the culture that we were trying to create. So I think the first step is absolutely trying to get those people on board. They also then have influence amongst their peers at those different levels. So using that influence to involve more of the leadership teams and really to help to again, get that message out to a wider audience. Some of the things that's worked really well for us, though, has actually been involving customers and suppliers and trying to turn this into something that is clearly business relevant and important for the business. And we held an event with a CEO from one of our big strategic airline customers, and immediately all of our senior leadership were there. The CEO was there, his first time all there. So actually, it's a great way to entice them in and demonstrate that there's also a business benefit as well as the individual personal benefits that we get from an inclusive culture. So I think that's a really good hook to pull the leadership in and show that actually it applies at all levels, including at the very, very top. Middle management is the area that we always struggle with, so they don't have that freedom to make demands like the senior leadership can. And they've got their deadlines and targets to hit. So that's always the difficult area, but certainly for the more senior leadership levels, get them involved, use role models, and show them as a business why we must be doing this.
Yes. Something I've heard Craig Shanahan, who's the president of Wood Operations, a quote he often uses. He says, "What interests my boss fascinates me," and I think it's true that if the leadership of an organisation actually are genuine in their allyship, that will be reflected. Now, just picking up from what Greg was saying there, you can have a scenario where if a leader has people in their actual world, not just the professional world, that identify with certain experiences, it's a lot easier for them to be sympathetic to that cause. But it's quite possible to live your actual life without necessarily having to engage with people, for example, people from ethnic minorities and so on. So, Pavneet, just based on your experience, would you like to just add something to that? You know, how do we deal with the question that there are hierarchies within organizations? Like most people, like I've often heard said, most of our organizations look like a pint of Guinness, white at the top, black at the bottom. How do we address that?
Yeah, really, really wonderful question, actually. Just because we have a hierarchy within an organisation doesn't mean we need to have distance between the layers. And I think it's really important to understand if there is distance between the layers, why does that exist and what causes that, what creates that? And so similarly to the quote that you said there, which is what fascinates me, what interests my manager fascinates me. What about the other way around? Which a leader must look at and understand what fascinates the rest of the organisation, regardless of what level or what role they exist within. And another thing that can overlay the hierarchy is shared behaviours. How have we defined how we want to work together? How do we communicate well together? How do we collaborate together through hierarchies and layers and cross teams? And some of those cultural traits are able to then reduce some of the distance that exists between the layers, and therefore support us in understanding each other better, understanding what the challenges are at different points in the organisation, but also working together to create those solutions. And often we do feel as if Sarah mentioned it earlier on in the previous panel, that we look to those with marginalised identities to tell us what to do. But we can all explore that together through curiosity. So really having the principles to define how we work well together, even if we have layers and big hierarchies, is a good starting point.
Yes, and Polly, I know at the Royal Academy, you have a number of resources, and there's a lot of work actually going into inclusive cultures, the findings of which will be very helpful to various organisations. Would you like to tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, so our Inclusive Cultures research we first did in 2017, so that really gave a picture of what inclusion looks like within the engineering profession. And our findings from that and the kind of recommendations led to a series of toolkits and resources, some of which will be posted, I know if you're online, in the online chat, but there's an Inclusive Cultures toolkit. There's also a series of team workshops for project teams coming together, kind of 1 hour workshops which you can use to develop an inclusive culture from the outset. And we'll be redoing that research through a number of focus groups, surveys and research, and the survey will open next month. So just a quick plug to say that is coming out next month, and we're hoping to see kind of what's happened in the last 5 years. Has the culture of engineering, has the inclusivity levels, and how different groups experience inclusion in engineering, how has that changed in the last 5 years? I'd want to just pick up on the question from before, just carrying on from Pavneet as well, just around the kind of formal and informal structures that are in place around hierarchies. So if you've got the formal structures, looking at kind of where you can devolve decision making down, and where there are structures for kind of team projects and where you've got team leaders, can you rotate those? Can you share those? Can you have junior staff members making presentations, and really thinking through some of those formal ways, but then also the informal structures. Where does power lie within an organisation? Are there kind of informal groups where decisions are taken, and actually accessing those informal groups? Or they're positive informal groups where then that's empowering people to come along, and that could be through employee resource net groups, but it could also be outside of that as well. So that's having a look at kind of the formal and informal structures, and they'll be different for each organisation, and really kind of drilling down on those to look at where you can kind of expand them out to be more inclusive. Right. But yes, the toolkits that we've got in the resources are co-produced with engineering companies, and many of which are kind of online and in the room with us today, so do take a look, but we'll be refreshing those over the next 6 months based on the research we're doing again.
And one other thing to help foster understanding amongst leaders, as often spoken about, is reverse mentoring. Now, I don't know if you've been a reverse mentor yet, but I'm sure you have a mentor. How do you think that works? Have you seen any sort of evidence that your mentor benefits from the relationship with you? Just would you like to say something about the concept of reverse mentoring?
Not in reference to my mentor, but in reference to my project lead. I'll give an example. I've been organising social events for my team. And someone on our team, he is religious and he follows his religion quite strictly. So for that reason, he doesn't enter places that serve alcohol. And I think kind of everyone just thought, oh, okay, he doesn't drink alcohol, so we're not gonna, he just won't turn up to future events. And I was like, hang on, he doesn't drink alcohol, but there are places that we can go where he will be able to come, and we can accommodate him, and we can change kind of like what is traditionally seen as a team building activity to include him. So I felt that, and then kind of like he was on board, and then we've kind of like, we're hoping to implement that soon. So I guess kind of in that respect, like, just also coming down the hierarchy as well, and just asking, people, the younger generation and middle management as well, like what they would do, because I think sometimes we rely on people who are higher to lead the way, and I think that everyone should be contributing to that conversation in terms of leading the way forward.
I'm glad you mentioned something around faith, which often gets missed out of these conversations. One of the questions in the app is around faith and inclusion, which can often be a taboo subject in certain circles. And, I certainly remember some of my colleagues, after an event happens, perhaps there's been a terrorist attack or something like that, and I observe some of my Muslim colleagues, for example, just the anxiety and the fear that people are going to look at them and think, these are your people, in that, to use a very shocking sort of term. Would anyone in the panel just like to talk about that? How do we ensure that faith and beliefs are a core part of our strategy.
I think it's important to think about, again, the differences in our demographic identities for all individuals, and actually focusing on one thing will only support one part of one person's identity. So that's why we have to think about things as individual human beings with lots of different parts to them. But the concept of psychological safety is a really important one when looking to support something that to answer this particular question, and actually links to what Yetunde was saying there a moment ago, that somebody chose to disclose that there was a level of discomfort with this particular environment, therefore they didn't necessarily feel valued or accepted or supported. So Yetunde's suggestion was to let's recraft this experience. And so the first thing I would say is don't make any assumptions about what we think that person might need. And to be curious and to ask them really explicitly, what is it that is going to enable you to feel more supported and valued and accepted within this environment? And because when we start to make assumptions, we're then walking into a power dynamic and reinforcing the fact that we know all the answers because we are a leader of the organisation, and we don't. So asking really simple questions to individuals, what is it that you need, is a wonderful place to start. But then also coming back to, and that will enhance psychological safety, but also creating those spaces within the organisation for people to share and to speak and to be heard and feel supported in group settings, and that might be in the team environment. So if we're thinking about a particular incident that may have occurred, then if we start our team conversation with, let's recognise what has just happened in the world yesterday. Did we want to talk about it for a few minutes? Do we want to just explore how everyone here is thinking and feeling about that? Does anyone need anything specific in order to feel supported today? And you may get so many different responses, and that's why coming back to this individualized approach to inclusion is really important. So we didn't really touch on faith, but that is a method that you can use to explore psychological safety within group settings to support individuals with the things that they personally need.
That's a very important point. It's not treating people as if they suddenly become an automaton as soon as they get into the building. They're real people, and if you had events that happened the day before, I remember after the Euros last year, how a lot of people felt when they saw those 3 black boys miss a penalty and the torrent of abuse that they were getting online. And that has an impact on just the way people feel coming into work, and it's quite good practice to just recognize that and have conversations around that. Are there any other questions from the floor? Yeah.
Hi, Jenny Young again. We had a round table recently, and one of the issues that came up was this idea of sort of zero tolerance around making mistakes around diversity and inclusion. I'm just interested in the panel's view on creating an environment where people feel like they can evolve and explore issues and ask questions and have conversations without being scared of saying the wrong thing or making mistakes and that in itself being career suicide, if you like. It's perhaps a bit of a vague question, but just that environmental creation, I think, is something I'm just remembering
the conversation I had with everyone before, but I don't want to be unfair to the panel, so I'm just going to ask: is there anyone who'd like to take that up?
I'm happy to take that one.
I was going to ask you anyway. So
I feel like being picked on a little bit here.
Sorry.
I think zero tolerance is important in terms of recognising there's an issue and doing something about it. I think what's really important, though, is that the punishment shouldn't just default to the most severe punishment. I think education is really important, and when somebody does something or says something that's inappropriate, there's levels of severity. Was the intent positive but they phrased it wrong, or was it deliberately malicious? And on that scale, I think the punishment needs to fit the bill. So education is really, really important, I think, because if somebody makes that kind of comment, you need to help them understand why it's wrong, what the impact can be on other people, and try and educate them to move away from that kind of thinking into a more inclusive mindset. So I think that's a really, really important aspect when it comes to sort of tolerance. generally, I think it's really important that we have safe spaces where we can have those conversations. So we don't want people to feel like they can't say anything, and that will just isolate and exclude people because they'll have their fears. It's only natural that they'll have questions. And if they feel they can't speak up, then actually we're not going to create an inclusive culture. We're just going to isolate those people. So we do run specific sessions, either listening sessions or just open forums where people can come in, and we make it clear, ask us anything. And I always say this at the start of my sessions, ask me anything. And if you say something, if you use the wrong terminology or you phrase something badly, I'll tell you. But I won't be offended because I know you're here to learn and you're asking the questions because you want to learn. So I'll encourage that open discussion, but in return, if I'm correcting you, then please take that on board, please learn from it, and please try to avoid that mistake in the future. So open, honest conversation is really, really important. But where mistakes do happen, look at the intent. Was it positive intent or was it malicious? And then don't just default. It'd be easy to sack everybody, but that person's going to walk away probably being more racist, more homophobic, whatever it is, because of that punishment. So education, I think, is really, really key.
I think education is vital, and I think quite often people are either talking across purposes and not really hearing the other, and I think that's a very important part. There was a point raised in the previous session, a very powerful point that Mark raised around NDAs, and I have heard various horror stories of people who have had to, it's the version of agree to disagree, and for me that's evidence of a failed strategy if it has to come to that. But what are the thoughts around around just banning them altogether? What are the thoughts around NDAs? And anyone on the panel have anything to say about that?
I think for what are we trying to preserve, protect, or stop from getting out with an NDA? I think an NDA serves its purpose in some situations, but when we're dealing with the experiences of individuals or of human beings, we're silencing people when actually that could be part of the healing process for the organisation and for the individual too. And just to touch upon the point around zero tolerance policies, I find so interesting because they don't necessarily encourage learning and growth for individuals and collective. When somebody makes a mistake, we all learn from that. And so when we think about policies that prevent mistakes, or we should reframe that to be policies that prevent harm. And so when we're thinking about mistakes, we're looking at then the impact, how we can then resolve for that in the future. But when people are harmed, that's when the zero tolerance kicks in. So that was really waffly.
Makes sense. Have a threshold beyond which. Any other questions from the floor? There was somebody at the back. Thank you.
Hello. Can you hear me? Great. Osita Madhu, HS2, High Speed 2 for those in the room. Interesting discussion around inclusive culture. I mean, what I've seen in my experience are two things that really is a barrier to inclusive culture, and that is fear and trust. And so you often get at the leadership level fear of what the change around inclusive culture will mean to them. And often those at the leadership, it's about them being pushed out the organization or somebody coming in that looks different to them. There's also fear around what the change will bring in terms of the actual organization. And you're sitting in a leadership position, and it's like, things are working well, we're a high-performing organization, what's the issue? So that's often the challenge back. Why do we need to have an inclusive culture when things are working well as they perceive it? And then you get from underrepresented group in the organization, trust. There's issues around trust of leadership, and we've seen examples of that happen. We know that those from ethnic minority background feel not as encouraged to come forward and talk about their real experiences. So when you have staff network or employee networks, I've seen in the past where Black staff are reluctant to get involved, and Asian staff are reluctant to get involved because it's seen as a group that talks about ethnic issues relevant to ethnic people. And they fear promotional prospects will be hampered. They feel all sorts of issues will happen in terms of their prospects career-wise. So I guess my question is, have you seen examples where fear and trust has really sort of created barriers to sort of the inclusive culture you want to create?
Absolutely. I mean, just before I ask the panel, I'd just like to say something on that point. The sector that I work in did a major survey last year, first of its kind, looking at these issues around inclusivity, and they came up with an index, and they categorized that index for various protected characteristics or various groupings. And the ultimate sort of result of this survey was that the lowest score in areas were people who had a disability or people who were black, and not ethnic minority, but specifically they disaggregated the ethnicity stats for people who are black. The reaction to it was interesting because there was a lot of reluctance. When the report was published and the results were published, we focused more on something that wasn't even in the report because it was viewed as controversial, and that can sometimes be. So to the panel, have you seen this at work, and how do we address it? How do we address it? Yeah.
So I suppose that the fear and trust, I think starting in terms of the building blocks that Pavneet said, it's starting in terms of defining what does an inclusive culture look like within this organisation, and what do those factors look like. So what would open and trusting environment look like, and having the senior leadership involved in defining that. What would respect look like, and pulling out those different factors and then defining that with senior leaders, so everyone has really clear expectations of kind of what expectations around behaviour, around communication style, around management styles and management within the organisation. And then it's that, well, what does the current culture look like, and where are the gaps, and is it gaps for particular groups? And then that's when you can interrogate some of the data, whether that's quantitative or qualitative through groups, employee resource groups or surveys. So the trust piece, I think also plays into what Mark was saying around the links to other agendas around kind of health and safety, and you can make the case to senior leaders, and particularly for those from majority backgrounds, that you may be a high performing company, but can you perform better? Are certain groups not feeling as included and leaving? So you're looking at your retention rates, etc. So you can really look at where can you be better as an organisation, because you may be high performing just in some areas, but if you're looking at it in terms of how included people feel to speak up about mistakes or safety concerns, in terms of retention, there'll be areas that won't be high performing if you're just looking at the financial numbers at the top. So I think it's that kind of big picture, particularly for the senior leaders around and the trust piece in terms of playing into the kind of business case for it, the different elements that feed in. Yeah. And
just to build on the second point that you raised around, you said about employees maybe being fearful of joining networks, and you even said about, they think they might not get promotions on the back of that kind of activity. My experience was the total opposite. So prior to joining a network, I was hiding in the shadows, and I wasn't doing particularly well. I was just one of 50,000 people in a huge organisation. And as I said at the start, after joining the network, my performance improved, back-to-back promotions. So I use that when I hear similar comments in the company, I use that as evidence to say, actually, that's not how it needs to be. This is a chance for you to really get out there, make yourself known, do something a bit different, show off different skills, learn, meet new people, and really accelerate your career. And in terms of the network itself, I think what's really, really important is that allies must be involved in the networks as well. So for our LGBT network, we have committee members who are straight. We have white employees who support our Black and Asian employee networks. And having them involved gives a different perspective, but also shows that the networks are for everyone, because you need everyone in the business to be on board to really drive culture change. So that's something that's really, really important to help make those networks be successful and really drive that change throughout the company.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, and so I'd like to just get each of the panel to just give us one sort of leaving message, if there are a number of practical things that you would like to see in terms of creating inclusive cultures within our organizations, what would those be? So I'll start with you, Yetunde.
Probably just for people to remember that in order to create an inclusive culture, you have to include everyone's experiences. So like we've all said, like everyone doesn't have the same experience, and not everyone's experiences are visible. And also remembering that diversity goes past just gender and ethnicity, and race. Those are the things I feel like we quite focus on. But it goes past that. It goes disability, people's cultures, their religion. Like it goes past that. And in order to create that inclusive environment, you need to acknowledge all of those things, and not just kind of like the ones that we hear about more often or the ones that are more publicised.
Absolutely, Greg.
For me, I would say that a lot of people still find this an uncomfortable topic to discuss. So I would say normalise discussing diversity and inclusion. Go back to your organisations tomorrow and talk about what you've learned today, talk about where you were, what you were doing, and just make it an everyday topic of conversation.
Yeah, nice. To expand on that, I would say go back again tomorrow and ask this question to your teams. What makes an inclusive culture for them? You'll hear lots of different responses, and you'll be able to, that could be a really nice way to take that small first step away from the fear and the avoidance.
And I say that inclusion, in creating inclusive culture, takes everybody. And everyday small acts of inclusion every day. So I would look to celebrate and recognise the small acts of inclusion that you see in your colleagues, and really bring it to the forefront.
Thank you. And just to round up what everyone's been saying, there's a quote that I've been using quite a bit, and to me it sums up the conversation we're having here. And it's a St. Augustine quote, and it says, "Hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, the courage to actually make the change." And I think ultimately, when all's said and done, that's what we need, a little bit of courage, just to challenge the culture, challenge the norms, and to actually see a change, so that we're not just getting better at articulating the problem, we actually are starting to see real transformation in people's work and lived experiences. Yes, so this is actually quite a good question. There was a question for me as well on here. What is the name of the survey referred to? Examine indices. It's called Building a Baseline, the OG UK survey. So if you look at Oil and Gas UK. But the question was, using one word other than included, how does or would working in an inclusive culture make you feel? I like the fact that valued is what is centered. Fantastic. If we could all take this actually to our companies and share it with our colleagues, or I don't know how many companies have started to do this thing where you alternate your safety moments and inclusion moments. So 1 week you do a safety moment and then inclusion moment. This is a very good one to add. I think it's really a good reflection of what an inclusive culture would bring, and why we should all be considering this. I've never been a big fan of the business case, even though I know there is a genuine case for it. I've always found the idea of saying to a group of people, if you're all a bit nicer to me, you might earn a bit of extra money. I've always found that a little bit difficult. But there is a business case for it. But I think this provides you with a moral case, and it's going to be good for every business. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to this fantastic panel. Put our hands together for it.